Hi, I'm Tyler Dawn Rosenquist of theancientbridge.com, and this is a brand new teaching, and I'm so excited about this. I found this concept of territoriality and voice in one of my social science books, and I'll tell you about that later. And I'd seen it in a bunch of different places before, but no one had ever really tied it all together until I found this article by Jerome Nere that it's a paradigm buster. And so this teaching is entitled, Why Aren't We Like the First Century Church? I've seen this question a lot over the years, and especially when I was Pentecostal and I was in the out of church movement, people would say, well, there's something wrong with us because we're not working miracles anymore. But that was always based on this paradigm of what the function of miracles was in biblical times. And a lot of times we don't realize, we don't have an understanding of why people were working with miracles. We just assume that the reasons we want miracles were the reasons that they needed miracles. And we have a bunch of paradigms. So we're going to talk about this, and I'm so excited. So let's dive right in. First of all, let's talk about the audience of the Bible. Great scholar John Walton, we all love him. He says the Bible was written for us, but not to us. And what does that mean? That means the context is different. If I was writing a book to Americans, I would write it in a certain way. If someone was going to translate into Chinese, they'd have to change some things because our context is different. If I say that my husband's going out to cook some dogs on the barbecue, well, I don't have to say that they're hot dogs, but to someone in Asia, they could actually mean a literal dog because in their culture, that's food. Okay? But we would never think about that, so what they would be visualizing in their mind and what I would be saying would be two entirely different things. But I'm speaking the truth, and they're not hearing anything that's culturally wrong for them, but there's a gap in communication, and that's why we study the history and the context, and why I love studying sociology, biblical sociology, because the social world in Bible times was incredibly different than now. They thought in different ways. And obviously, when they thought of a house, they thought of something that looks a lot different than we think of. Anyway, sometimes we ask the wrong questions. It's not why aren't we like the first century church? It's why was the first century church the way it was? Do we need the same power today that they had? Or why were they given power in the first place? These are really important questions that I never asked myself until recently when I read this article, and it just about blew the top of my head off. All right, so whoops. Okay, so modern paradigms. What do we think about miracles? We think that miracles are for doing good deeds, solving problems. As the mother of a special needs child, can I say right now that if my son were completely healed, and he's been partially healed, don't get me wrong, and I'm grateful, but if he'd be completely healed, it would solve a lot of our problems, especially financial. Um, and we think of them in order to impress people. And, some of those are kind of right, but culturally they're all entirely wrong too. So how about other paradigms that we read into the Bible text? We have the right, and this one's going to seem unrelated, but it's not. We have the right as Westerners to speak our minds whenever we want and wherever we want under the auspices of freedom of speech. Is that something we can read into the Bible text? We're going to see. Sometimes we think we have the right to be heard and believed simply because we are preaching something that we believe is true. How would that have held up in the ancient world? All people are created equal. That wouldn't have even held up 400 years ago. Goodness sakes, that wouldn't have even held up before the civil rights movement. Let's be honest, right? How about we have this paradigm that people are all unique individuals who cannot be judged by things that are outside of their control, namely their genetics, place of origin, wealth, and family reputation. Well, that's really important to us. It's really important to me. Would Bible people have agreed? We're going to see. People are introspective by nature, examining their own motives and actions independently from outside input. Now, we're not going to talk about that one today, but that one is totally false. People didn't think individual thoughts, and they didn't think about themselves apart from what everyone was telling themselves about them. I wrote about that in Context for Adults, Sexuality, Social Identity, and Kinship Relations in the Bible. It's way too complicated to go, oh, but I do on my YouTube channel have a 3-part teaching on dyadic social identity where I talk about that. So check that out. No need to buy a book if that's just what you want to, if you just want the social identity part of that. How about it's more important to be found innocent of a crime than to have a good reputation? Or it's more important to be innocent than to seem innocent. That was totally bogus in the ancient world. I wrote in Context for Kids, Honor and Shame in the Bible. Honor and shame culture, it's incredibly important to understand. That's going to come into what we're talking about today too, but I'm not going to go into that in really big detail. Okay, so the biggest modern paradigm that we are going to battle today is there are no more miracles because we're doing something terribly wrong in modern day religion. Well, it's not right. And I'm going to tell you why, but it's going to take a while. So it's going to be a 2-part teaching. So you're going to want to stick through both parts so we're going to get a lot of the way through it in this part, but not all the way. Okay, so the problem with paradigms. Of course, paradigms are ways of thinking that we're just locked into. We assume that everyone thinks the way that we do. That's a paradigm. Now, if we read the Bible with the assumptions that Bible people share our same cultural mindsets, we will generally completely misunderstand what's being expressed in a Bible passage. Okay, we'll think, oh well, they're thinking these thoughts. No. They didn't think the way we think. It makes it incredibly challenging, especially when we're getting into things like Yeshua or Jesus fighting with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, or the Sadducees and Pharisees fighting with each other. We don't understand why. We don't understand why it's such a big deal that this is happening, that's happening, but to them, it was a matter of life and death. It's completely different than the way we look at things. Bible people were group-oriented. That's dyadic social identity. It means that they saw themselves as members of a group instead of individuals who happen to be in groups with other individuals. Watch the other teaching. They were honor-shame focused, which means they were very, very obsessed with their own personal reputation, with their family's honor, and their idea of honor wasn't our idea of honor. We think of honor as personal integrity. Like a man with high honor wouldn't think twice about going in and rescuing orphans from an orphanage fire, right? That's what we think of honor. We think of firemen risking their lives, policemen risking their lives. Okay, but that we think of honor as an internal thing. They thought of honor as completely external. What's your reputation? How many honors have been given to you? And you could be a skunk and still have high honor in the ancient world. So totally unfair. But that was their context. Our ancestors kind of walked away from it. Okay, it doesn't make the Bible not true anymore. It just means that we got away from that. So we got to kind of go back to that to see what they're saying. They were non-scientific. They were spiritually oriented. So when they saw the sun in the sky, they didn't think of a self-contained, nuclear, reaction. They thought, well, there's a God running it. They didn't think of how there was a God running it. They saw gods and goddesses behind every phenomenon, or demons behind every phenomenon that there was. They didn't see things in terms of science. Whereas we go, oh, it's a sickness. Well, there's germs, there's bacteria, there's something's gone wrong genetically. No, they go, oh man, there's demons. It was just their mindset. Now, Bible says that sometimes it was demonic, but also sometimes it says things like, seizures. We know that's epilepsy. Anyway, so yeah, they saw everything as having spiritual reasons. We see things primarily as having scientific reasons. They were focused on the needs of right now instead of being forward thinking, and they were obsessed with stereotypes. All Cretans are liars. Really? Every single one? Come on, Paul. That was the way it was. Woe to you, Pharisees. Every single one? No, we know that some were great. We know that some were great. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, they were great guys. Followers of the Messiah. So, and yet when he would rebuke them, he'd rebuke them all. Because stereotypes. It was the way they talked back then. Bible people did not believe in freedom of speech and were only interested in listening to people that have something called voice. And that is why we are here today. So finally, we're going to get down to the actual teaching. Now, freedom of speech is a very new concept historically. The ancient world was governed by very strict rules of what is called territoriality. Now, you know what territory is. It's your space. It's the area that belongs to you, okay? Dogs know territory better than anyone. Not only will they pee all over their own territory if they come by yours, not yours, but your dog's territory, they'll pee on your dog's pee to claim that territory for themselves. Territoriality defined who had control in certain spheres, ranging from a person's own house to the emperor's palace. Houses, and actually houses as far as there were private and public areas of houses, courtyards, and courtyards is the shared space between a few houses, marketplaces, synagogues, government buildings, temples. They all had completely different rules as to who had the right to speak and what they could speak about. These rules were based on, number 1, gender, 2, age, 3, status. And they could change drastically from location to location. So somebody who has voice in one area, and say there's this guy who has voice in this area and this guy who doesn't, in another area, well, it's this guy and this guy doesn't have any voice. Okay? It'll make sense. Okay. So to have voice in a particular place meant that one had an authorized, a recognized authority to speak. And when I'm talking voice, I don't want you to go into the Bible and look at every time it says voice, because this is a sociological term. Okay? This is just a term that sociologists have come up with to describe the phenomenon of having the authority to speak. Okay? Voice in one area did not automatically transfer to other areas unless you were the emperor. Then, you speak wherever you want, about whatever you want, and anyone doesn't want to listen can just die. Okay? If we read the Bible with the mindset that anyone could speak any place that they wanted to and had the right to be heard or would even be listened to at all, we will read a lot into the text that is not there, and we will miss a lot of what is there. Okay, so the article that I took this from, okay, it's from this book, but you can also get it on the internet, and I'm going to put out the slide now. Jerome Nere, Teaching You in Public and From House to House, Acts 20:20, Unpacking a Cultural Stereotype. It's available in the Social World of the New Testament, as well as at that website right there. There's also another great article in this book by Richard Rohrbaugh, called The Social Location of the Markan Audience, and it's very related. It talks about hierarchies, social hierarchies, and I highly recommend both of those articles. So, next, so we're back to, now who can speak where? Now in the home, really we're looking at the patriarch, the oldest male, absolutely had absolute rights over most things, even over the life or death of the people of the house. Okay? But in the home, the patriarch, oldest male, had the right to say whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And then the rest of the people in the house, males in the house, had rights to speak based on age and relation to the patriarch, and the patriarch allowing them to speak. Now, in the government buildings, you get magistrates and those kind of people. Um, now here's the interesting thing. We talk about one person might be able to speak in one area and one person might be able to speak in the other area but doesn't cross over. Let's say there is a patriarch, there's a father, and his son is a magistrate down in the city, in the police. I know that sounds funny. Police. So in the house, the patriarch can say whatever he wants, and his son, who is a high-ranking magistrate, is at the mercy of his father. You know, he can't say anything to offend his father. He can't disrespect his father in any way. His father rules the home, okay? And he's subordinate. But if they go to the government buildings, the father has zero voice at all, unless someone who's in charge, like his son, a magistrate, asks him a question, and then he is able to answer the question. Okay? Think about Yeshua's, Jesus' disciples. What did they normally say? When they were speaking freely, they were kind of back on the road arguing with each other, right? But when they were with Yeshua, they were either asking him questions because he was teaching, or they were responding to him saying, what were you guys talking about? Well, we were kind of talking about who was going to be like greatest in the kingdom. It's not stuff that they would say in his presence because they didn't have voice. He had voice. He was the teacher. He was the one who sat down and taught them. If they asked questions, it was generally in private, out of respect, because you wouldn't want to stump your teacher publicly. Anyway, just entirely, it wasn't like a free-for-all. People weren't raising their hands and stuff while he was teaching. Now, in Scripture, we see lots of different places. Out in the wilderness. Out in the wilderness, if you can get an audience to come out to see you, you got voice. John the Baptist, right? Open spaces. It's very similar to wilderness. The synagogue officials had voice, and if they invited you up to speak, you had voice, okay? But there wasn't anyone who was just going to be doing what they wanted to do. Private home, you've got your public spaces in a private home, and private spaces. Private spaces is usually where the women were all the time, and the men were only there when it was time to sleep. Or eat, and if you were wealthy, the private home would have public and private areas. Well, private areas for eating and more public areas for eating. Just degrees of privateness. But it still all belonged to the man. Excuse me. Okay, the Hall of Tyrannus. That's the place where Paul rented for, what, a year and a half, 2 years? So he could speak. Paul rented it. He had voice. You know, nobody else was like interrupting his teaching and breaking in with their own little thing, right? In temples, priests had voice. Priests decided who, you know, and actually most people wouldn't dare speak up in a temple. Oh my gosh, are you serious? Not even the king, really. And palaces. Obviously you've got a hierarchy of who can speak, where emperor can speak anywhere he wants. Then you've got your high-ranking officials, down. And there were a lot of people who did nothing but just kept their mouths shut and hoped they weren't asked any questions. Because you give the wrong answer to a question, you're in big trouble. Okay, so every space in the ancient world was clearly defined, and people knew who could and could not speak. Now, here's something interesting that I just recently learned. I believe I learned this in R.T. France's The Commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. It's this thick, I kid you not. Awesome book. He's talking about the difference between the wise and the foolish in Scripture. You know, we think of it as a matter of intelligence, but it's not. This isn't the intelligent and the unintelligent. These were the people who knew their place and the people who didn't. So you could be smart and be a fool. And you could be unintelligent and you could be wise. It was all about knowing what your role was in society, knowing when to speak and when to keep your mouth shut. And really that makes a lot of sense when you go back and read the wise. And it says a wise servant will rule over a foolish son. So a servant who knows his place will rule over a son who doesn't know his place. It was total revelation for me. It just makes so much sense. So it's people who knew their place and who didn't. It sounds offensive to us, but it was just accepted until recently. If you ever watched Downton Abbey or the old Upstairs Downstairs, people in service were very proud to be in service, and they felt it was their place in society. They were serving their betters. They didn't say it as a way to demean themselves, just the way things were. Okay, so again, who can speak where? We have temples, priests, sages. Sages were the before 70 AD. There weren't any real rabbis. That's an anachronism. They were called sages, wise teachers, and like I said before, when a sage was with his disciples, he would be sitting, they would be gathered around him, he would be teaching, and they would keep their mouth shut until they were in private. Then they could speak. Then they could ask questions. Um, Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians. As far as who had the most voice, you got the Herodians on top, even though they were just vile collaborators with Rome. Sadducees were the priestly elite, and then the Pharisees were really scholarly laymen. There were only about 6,000 of them. There were very few Sadducees, comparatively. And synagogue visitors. If you were a visitor to a synagogue, they would often ask you, I want to know where you're from. And so that was to find out if they were going to let you come up. Can you read? That's a big one. Father in the house, you've got fathers, sons, women, and dinner guests. Each one of those would have different. The dinner guests would not have a voice unless the patriarch gave it to them, and that was an honor. Palaces, rented areas, government buildings, courts. We've been through all of that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what was the purpose of miracles in the ancient world, and this may surprise you. Miracles served one purpose above all others: to legitimize the authority of the messenger of God to speak in places that they generally did not have the right to speak. Okay? I want you to think about John the Baptist. Now, John had people coming out into the wilderness. Now, John never worked any miracles. Why didn't John need to work any miracles? John was a priest. John was an elite class. It doesn't matter how poor you were as a priest. If you were a priest, because when you look at the function of priests in the Old Testament, it says to teach the people Torah, to teach them the difference between unclean and clean, and holy and unholy. And yes, those are two different things entirely. But people knew that priests needed to be listened to, especially in the first century. It wasn't like in Old Testament times where the people weren't listening to the priests as much. Then we get to Yeshua, Jesus, a carpenter. Now, I know if you've ever had your kitchen redone, you have a lot of respect for carpenters because you know how much money they make. And they are skilled craftsmen. But in the ancient world, any day laborer, any craftsman, any artisan was considered almost like a slave because they were cut off from the land. They didn't have their own land. They were working for wages. Okay, it wasn't honored the way that it was if you had land. And the more land you had, the more honor, the more renown and reputation you had. So somebody like Yeshua wasn't going to be listened to unless he was doing things like healing the sick, raising the dead, casting out demons, changing water into wine. All right? He just wasn't. Whereas John was a priest. John was born with what they call it gravitas. Okay? John was born with street cred. Yeshua wasn't. All right, we'll talk about that more in the second part of the teaching. When the 12 were sent out, what were they sent out being able to do? He said, preach the gospel, cast out demons, heal the sick. Okay, those things were combined. He didn't just send them out with a message because nobody would have listened to, oh, here's fishermen. Yeah, let's just listen to a bunch of fishermen. No, they had no voice in the ancient world. God giving them miraculous powers gave credibility to the message. Certainly the miracles did good deeds. You know, they dazzled, and they was they solved problems for people, but that wasn't the function. The function was to give authority and legitimacy to what they were preaching. People going, there's even one place they say, well, how can somebody do all these things if they're not from God? Was the whole point. Okay. So, and the thing is, we can see from the writings of the early church fathers, okay, for the first few hundred years, the early church, and especially the first few centuries in the Gentile world, they did work miracles. They were still raising the dead and healing the sick and doing all this stuff until the Roman government legally gave them voice, the right to speak. Once it was made the state religion, well, once it was made a legitimate religion, which it had never been up to that point, they were on the outs for the entire time until the time of I should be, I could tell you any other time. Constantine. See, I was thinking Charlemagne. I'm going, no, you're hundreds of years off. Stop it. So until the time of Constantine, it was really dangerous to speak out if you were a Christian. But once that happened, you see them tapering off because all of a sudden they've got authority to speak. Excuse me. Okay, so we're going to talk about priest or peasant here, and we're almost done with this section of this teaching. You see an interesting trend in the Old Testament, which Jews call the Tanakh, and or the Hebrew writings. Priestly prophets rarely work miracles, and a lot of times if they work miracles, it'll be like in private, like Ezekiel with the dry bones. There was no witnesses. It was just Ezekiel and God. Okay? Priestly prophets rarely work miracles, if at all, whereas nobodies like Elijah, Elisha, and Yeshua turn out to be the greatest miracle workers. It's all about who needs the credibility. Are you somebody who people are going to socially want to listen to, or are you someone they're going to want to turn up their nose at? So let's talk about the priests who do not work miracles but are prophets. Samuel, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, possibly Amos. He was a shepherd of Tekoa, and a lot of the shepherds were Levitical shepherds. John the Baptist. None of them were working miracles for the people. Okay? They were all very powerful prophets. Let's talk about who needed to work miracles to be listened to. Moses. If you read Exodus 3 and 4, you see Moses going, but they're not going to listen to me. I am slow of speech. What does that slow of speech mean? That he had a stuttering problem? No. He has no credibility. No one's going to listen to him. And that's why the Lord said, well, I'm going to send your brother Aaron. Well, Aaron was well respected. And his sister Miriam was a prophetess. So he was somebody who had lived his entire life among the Jews. He had credibility. But what did he do for Moses? He says, okay, I'm going to give you miracles so that people will listen to you. Gave him the staff. Did the thing with that leprous hand. All the things that he allowed Moses to do were so that people would give Moses voice. They would listen to him. Joshua. As soon as Moses dies and they crossed over into the promised land, God says, I'm going to do something for you today where no one will ever doubt your authority. No one will ever refuse to listen to you. Part of the Jordan. Okay, so he'd be accepted as a new ruler. Daniel. He was mighty in wisdom, and then there was the thing that he ate nothing but vegetables and water for, 3 weeks, and he looked more robust than the people who were eating better. Elijah, Elisha, Yeshua, and the apostles. Okay? So we're all people. Oh, and for that matter, here's somebody. Here's a really good example that somebody brought up when I was teaching this the other night. Paul. Okay, Paul was greatly respected in the Jewish community, okay, among the Pharisees. Greatly respected. He sat at the feet of Gamaliel. He was an officer of the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court. It talks about that in the stoning of Stephen. where he held their coats, and he wouldn't have even been able to be there if he had not been an officer of the court. Um, but So he totally blew his voice with the believers, wouldn't you say? I mean, he was arresting them, dragging them off to Jerusalem and to uh, to be persecuted. Well, what happens? It's the miracle of the blindness, and then when that one believer who saw him, that I can't remember for the life of me what his name is now, um, he sees the scales fall away. That was a miracle, and he could see. That miracle gave Paul credibility with the church there. All right? Because through that he was allowed to speak. People, because we always like, whoa, he's the guy who's persecuting us. No, we're not going to listen to him. We're not going to let him anywhere near us. Run. Don't blame him. Okay, so bottom line, priests had the authority to speak for God with or without miracles. But mere peasants and commoners did not. Miracles transformed a nobody into a spokesman for God. Okay. And this is just going to be a really, really quick one here. There's a lot of controversy over this one. In 1 Timothy 2, we see Paul saying that he does not allow a woman to teach a man. Okay? This is not something to just brush past, but we can see where voice would tie into this, okay? Now, in Acts, we very clearly see Priscilla teaching Apollos, teaching him the way more perfectly. But we see that she pulled him aside. She's not teaching him in public, okay? Because in the ancient world, that would have been incredibly unwelcome. It would have been unseemly. It would have been disgraceful. I mean, seriously, disgraceful. We see women as prophetesses and everything in ancient Israel and stuff. But in the Roman Empire, it's very, very important for the believers to be seen very seemly, very respectably. But yeah, Priscilla's teaching Apollos, but Paul loves Priscilla, and he says he doesn't allow a woman to teach a man. So let's look at territoriality and cultural norms for private space versus public space. Out in public, it would have been entirely inappropriate for Priscilla to be seen teaching a man. It was disgraceful. It was shameful. In our culture, it doesn't mean the same thing, but back then it really, really did, because of something called the New Roman Woman, which is also part of my Dyadic Social Identity series. So check that out. When people would meet from house to house, if they were meeting in the courtyard, that was still in public. Anyone could walk in. And if you saw a woman teaching men, it would be extremely disgraceful. It would be a disgrace. But in private, it's a completely different thing. And the difference is teaching versus authentian. It's instructing somebody in private versus taking unauthorized authority over somebody. And really none of us should do that. But all the epistles all stress the importance of behaving in a culturally appropriate and respectable way. And that's it for this half. And I'm going to start again in a minute with the next half of this teaching.